Awesome. So welcome, everyone. On behalf of World of Wellesley, I'd like to thank our 5 guest panelists, awesome team here, and everyone who came out today, despite the cold weather and daylight savings time change. Thank you for coming. And take a minute to look up our website. It's worldofwellesley.org, and you can check out all the fabulous programs we run all through the year. And feel free to subscribe so you're up to date on all the cool stuff that we do. Each year, the World of Wellesley has a community book read program that provides an opportunity for a community to engage in learning and discussion of issues central to the World of Wellesley's mission to promote community, belonging, and anti-racism. At its core, the World of Wellesley is a nonprofit that focuses on education. This year's selection, Unmasking AI, My Mission to Protect What is Human in a World of Machines by Dr. Joy Bolamwini, to say that, allows us to consider how the data sets chosen for the creation of AI systems can amplify racism, sexism, albinism, and other forms of discrimination. As a graduate student, Dr. Bolamwini discovered widespread racial and gender bias in the AI data sets and algorithms used for facial recognition by tech giants such as IBM, Microsoft, Meta, Facebook, and Google. So already, as it is, AI systems are being used to decide who gets hired, the quality of medical treatment we receive, whether or not we become a suspect in a police investigation. And while these tools show great promise for human benefit, they can also cause harm and damage for marginalized people and threaten civil rights. So, for example, just as a show of hands, raise your hands out there, all of you, any of you who've had ever had facial recognition or fingerprint access problems with your iPhone or your computer or at a store or with going through TSA? Anybody had trouble with those kinds of things? So we're all eager, so thank you, and we're all eager to hear from our fabulous panelists. This is a very, very apropos topic that we're all interested in. So I'd like to invite our panelists to start off and introduce themselves, take about a minute to briefly introduce yourselves to our audience. And please let us know, how did you get involved with AI and how are you currently using or working with AI? And I'm going to start off with Michael.
I think I'll be talking loud enough on this one, the mic.
Yep, you can turn the microphone towards you.
Really? Okay, all right.
Is it on?
Yeah, it's on, yeah. I thought it would be loud enough, but fair enough. Mike Dupin, I work for Wolters Kluwer as the Director of Advanced Technology. I have been involved in AI for the past 20-odd years, and we were just actually talking about what even is AI. So when we say AI, we're going to be taking it as a broad term, at least I am, until we say it's more specific, like generative AI, you know that, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about that. And what do we do at Wolters Kluwer in terms of AI? We are taking our data and automating it, making sure that we can really get the juice out of AI, out of our data through AI insights, and sprinkling agents as well as algorithms within our products to keep a competitive edge against our competitors. So that's it at me.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Anderson. I'm a professor at Wellesley College in computer science. My PhD is actually in linguistics, though, and I guess my start in AI is that I started building benchmarks for exploring how well language models understood language back when language models weren't very large and were mostly just a kind of niche interest for natural language processing researchers and linguists interested in computational models of language. And I found my research sort of becoming encompassed in AI as large language models have become more of a primary kind of AI that people are interested in and using out in society. And so these days, a lot of my work still focuses on how do we evaluate AI, in particular large language models, how do we evaluate their capabilities in a way that is challenging and also fair to human ability. And particularly this year, I'm focused on the implications of large language models that generate computer code for work in the sciences. So how could this technology help scientists do their work more efficiently or spend more of their time on the part of their jobs that they really care about, which is the scientific research?
Hi, I'm Zach Ziegler. I grew up in Wellesley. I went to Fisk and Wellesley Middle School and Wellesley High School, so it's especially fun to be here. As a kid, I loved playing video games, and of course I wanted to know how video games work and how to make video games. And so that is kind of originally how I got into computer science and programming, and eventually found myself starting a PhD program in computer science at Harvard, where I was working on natural language processing and probabilistic generative models. And this was the whole kind of mathematical underpinning of what today becomes large language models and AI and all the craziness that we're seeing. About kind of 1 or 2 years in, I started to increasingly ask myself, how do I really have an impact in this space? How do I do something real, something concrete that touches real people? And around that time, I got connected with my co-founder, Daniel Nadler, and we started Open Evidence, which builds AI tools for physicians to help physicians be more effective, efficient, and just overall give physicians access to all of the world's medical knowledge and make that queryable and searchable. And today, that's used in over 7,000 hospitals and care centers around the United States and in over 150 countries. So it's been a very cool experience to kind of see this through. And I think, especially in the context of this book, healthcare is obviously one of the most critical spaces, but one of the most sensitive spaces as well for bias and things like that. So I think it's especially pertinent for this discussion.
Hello, my name is Tanuj, and I am a senior at Wellesley High School. So my interest in AI really started around middle school. I've always been, since I was young, interested in math and then computer science. And AI really has interested me mainly because underneath it all, it really is just math and data science. And I really find it fascinating how math can be used to create such things like using things like vectors to help computers understand how sentences work. And right now, I mainly study AI, learn AI. I am still a student, and I also try and teach AI through a company I co-founded called Next Gen Kids AI. Basically, it combines my passions for, I have some experience teaching and also my passion for artificial intelligence. And through that company, we typically teach at places like the YMCA. We teach students in middle and high school about artificial intelligence and how it works. And besides that, I also do try and make some coding projects of my own. And that's my experience right now.
Boy, that's a very inspiring and intimidating group of people to come after. I'm Aaron Pressman. I'm a business reporter at the Boston Globe. AI is not a deep specialty of mine. I was a history major way back when, and I have been following the developments of business and technology for a long time. One thing that really struck me about Joy's book, and that I hope we will get into today, is that while there is incredible promise you're hearing here about these new technologies, we have definitely found with social media and the internet and other kinds of things that we also need to be aware of how these things can be misused, either intentionally or unintentionally. And we need to be thinking ahead about what might happen, what might go wrong, what might go right. So I hope we'll get into that today. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you, panelists, and thank you, Aaron. That was wonderful that you just said that, because that leads me into my next question for you. So we're all learning new things every day about social media, about economic benefits related to the development and use of AI technology. At the same time, most of us are also concerned about the red flags, as you mentioned, and AI's potential downsides. So Dr. Bolamwini specifically focuses her attention on how coded bias in AI systems can impact marginalized individuals and communities. She also highlights that large data sets usually do not get consent from individuals whose data is being used. So I'd like to ask you, what personal information gets collected for AI development and how is it used? Michael, would love to start off with you again, please.
Yeah, thanks. That's a kind of loaded question, isn't it? So we can think of AI as many, many things. In Dr. Joy, I think she goes by Dr. Joy, book, she focuses mostly on computer vision, right? So you show a picture and there's a woman, there's a man, there's a cat, there's a dog, whatever. The computer knows how to recognize these things. So if you see the data trained here are images of people tagged through different tags. The problem then is what is the training set, without going into too much detail, but what did you feed the model to then get your model to respond somewhat accurately to a question? You show something else. And this is where the problem also comes, where do you get images? Well, you get images from the internet. You get images from television. You get images from newspaper that are already tagged. Because somebody is not going to go millions of times tagging this is a dog, a cat, a man, a woman, whatever. So that's a problem in terms of you can have biases right there, right? So if you have mostly white men, which happens a lot in our society, who gets a lot of attention? White men. And your models are not going to be very good at getting to different genders and different ethnicities. And then there's also a problem of privacy. Do I want my picture with my name, my gender, to be part of a model that I do not control? So I'm going to stop here and let other panelists respond to that. Yep.
So one of my research interests is in language diversity. And right now, when we talk about training data for language models, some models have pretty amazing multilingual abilities. So they've been trained on text from lots of different languages, and they can do things like machine translation. And that's great, but we also have to remember that not all languages are equally well represented online. And so when we scrape a bunch of data from the internet, which is how a lot of generative AI for producing language works, or what it's trained on, there are many speakers whose languages or varieties of speaking aren't captured in those data sets. And so then we have to ask, who's represented by those models trained on those data sets? And I think one of the themes of this book is that representation is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Do we want our data to be included in models so that they behave well for us? Or is there also a sense in which being included in training data sets could violate our privacy? And so I think there are a lot of kind of ethical issues that are really actually quite difficult here about, when do we want increased representation? What does representation mean? When we talk about data sets, building a data set is usually a multi-stage process. There's the maybe initial web scraping, but then there are lots of decisions to be made about what counts as quality data. So usually after you collect a large amount of data, you filter it for different properties. And there's work, for instance, on those quality filters for language models that shows that even if you look at just English language that's included in those data sets, those quality filters often capture are more likely to judge language produced by, for instance, students from high schools that are wealthy and predominantly white. They're more likely to deem that language as high quality and train on it than if you ask whether student newspapers from communities of color are high quality according to those same language filters. And so there are these, whenever we build a data set, that sounds like a very technological process, but there are lots and lots of social decisions that are being made, and all of those, I think, have ethical implications for representation.
I think also another, as mentioned previously, data scraping is used to get the data off the internet. And one issue with this is that if the data is not checked properly, sometimes AI-generated data is training AI itself. And some companies actually try to do this on purpose. They've been trying to have AI generate data so that they can retrain the AI on it itself. And this presents an issue where topics that are underrepresented in the original database become even more underrepresented because the output didn't represent it in the first place. And this is basically, some people call it AI inbreeding, in the sense that if you're training it on itself, it'll just start, for example, with ChatGPT, if you were to train it on its own produced text, it will start using the same words over and over again until its vocabulary was very narrow. For example, a lot of papers use ChatGPT nowadays to write write things like the abstracts for their research papers, and the result is a lot of these abstracts contained the word delve, which I don't know if you guys know, but that ChatGPT uses this particular word a lot. And so if you look at graphs of like how many times this word has appeared in text recently, delve appears a lot more just because ChatGPT uses it.
It is something that people are paying a lot of attention to. I recently spoke to a founder in New York City who is going to historically black colleges who have an incredible diversity of resources and historical documents that are not online. And so he's trying to find ways to raise money to have these documents come online and be used as an additional training set that can go on top of a typical large language model, perhaps to give a different perspective that's desired for many people who are using the large language model. The other thing I wanted to just point out to everybody is that your data that you're doing on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn is part of what these companies want to use as training data. Reddit is another big one. And it is something that you maybe want to think about. Do you want your words to be taken and used to train these models or not? I think they're largely, I think LinkedIn, I know, is giving people a choice to opt out, but it's something to pay attention to in the coming months and years.
Yeah, adding on to that point, I think just a brief add-on. I think a lot of terms and conditions for a lot of social media platforms nowadays are starting to adjust, and they'll put it in there that they can use your data to train models. And there's a way to opt out, but they typically make it very convoluted, just so you know. They can basically use your data. And yeah, I think that's one way in which people's data is being used a lot and people don't really even realize it.
Yeah, so I mean, this has been a great discussion. One thing that stands out to me is that as the world of machine learning and AI evolves, the trend is to get enormous in terms of the sizes of data sets. And in a lot of ways, that's enabling. And so, like you guys were saying, there can be problems in terms of, yes, your data is used in this sense, but, also very practically, that one sentence you have is part of, one of literally 1 trillion sentences or tokens that are part of these models. And so there is a smoothing, I think, that happens at scale. And there are pretty interesting properties of this. So for example, with images, if you're training image generative models, you might expect that if you train on 50,000 faces or whatever, that if you then generate a face, it'll be likely somebody in that data set. But there's actually the pretty surprising property that's not what happens. You actually get a totally new person, almost no matter what random seed you choose or how you choose to generate the image. So there is kind of an inherent smoothing process that happens, and kind of enables a lot of this semantic learning that is modern AI, essentially.
Great. Any other thoughts on that?
I'm just going to add one thing in terms of be careful of what data your data trail you are leaving. So it's easy to be afraid of Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever Gen X or Gen Z is now doing. But your phone is your worst enemy because every app that you have, and yes, you can opt out, but most likely you haven't, at least one of them. They track your geolocation. Like my phone knows that I'm next to Caroline here, and they'll say, "Oh, they're working together. Maybe something going on, or whatever." And they will also. There are companies grabbing the data to make inferences around my lifestyle. Maybe I go to the gym every morning, so then they're going to be pushing gym equipment, and that's part of the data, and that's going to be part also of training models, generative or not. To figure out how to best make money out of us. So it's really, I guess my main point here is be careful what you're afraid of, and what you should be afraid is what you are not afraid of. In all seriousness, I know it's cliche, but it's very, very, accurate in this context.
Great, thank you. So, in your opinions, what do you see as the positive social and economic advantages of AI? And there's no particular order, so whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
As part of Open Evidence, we're aiming to help physicians and give access to the best medical information. But even for myself personally, as an individual contributor, as a software engineer, we're kind of on the front line of a lot of these recent tools that leverage large language models. And what's really interesting, what I can speak of from like a very personal sense in terms of like using these sort of things is, I know, for example, like between ChatGPT and GitHub Copilot or Cursor or any of these modern tools that use large language models, like for software engineering, I can be like 5 times more effective and efficient as a software engineer. I think this is something that I think really resonates with anyone who's tried remotely to use these tools in a meaningful way. On the other hand, I was just talking with someone who's a professor at NYU who was teaching Introduction to Python. And what was really interesting to me was that his experience was that ChatGPT has completely annihilated the ability of kids to learn programming if they're not really actively trying to learn, because they'll, instead of trying to really focus on how to debug and how to code and the principles behind it, they'll just completely ignore all of that and just try to prompt ChatGPT to do their homework for them, basically. And that leads to kids failing that otherwise wouldn't be failing. And so what's really telling about these two anecdotes is that there's this, for exactly the same tool, there's this distinction between using it as an aid and an augmentation tool versus kind of replacement for humans. And the replacement, I think, clearly both fails because it doesn't work, and it just doesn't lead to kind of the best outcomes overall. And so what I see is that the best use of these tools comes at the intersection, comes from people who are still experts and are still good at the job and doing their job or whatever, but are enabled and made more productive by these types of things. And I think that type of thing is where we're going to see all of the benefits from AI in these next few years.
This is great because I was about to say exactly the same thing, which is I think that the best use cases are ones where technology is assisting humans rather than trying to replace humans. I think, when we consider any kind of job, oftentimes I think there is a lot of hype around automating jobs, right? And this is a trend for decades, right? There's been interest in automating jobs in different sectors. But often when you hear people talk about those jobs who don't do those jobs, there's a simplification of like what that job actually entails that I think is a little naive. And so, when people try and have agents that totally replace software engineers, to follow the programming example, that ignores all of the other things that a software engineer actually typically does, like communicating with customers about their needs, working as part of a team. There are all these other parts of the job beyond just the generating code part of the job. And so I think there's a danger there when we think about automating jobs fully, that we're a little naive about what the job actually is. But I think there's great potential for building tools that actually assist people who are already experts in their work. So I'm the most excited about that as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what's been said so far. I think as a personal anecdote, when I typically make my computer science projects, just whether typically my personal projects, I'll use ChatGPT a little bit, and it'll give me some code segments. And while obviously it cannot write big projects on its own, it is very helpful. I think, for example, I recently made a project that uses AI to make Quizlets for me, just like online flashcards. Because in my language classes, they typically just give me a whole list of words with their terms and definitions. So I can just take a picture and it'll turn that into an online flashcard set for me. And for that project, ChatGPT has been really helpful in coding some of the very tedious parts that are very simple and yet would take a long time to write. But then when it comes to actually like putting the whole project together, it doesn't really understand any of that. So I think when it comes to like, the basic skill sets, ChatGPT can definitely like replace those. So like, as mentioned previously, it's a big problem for intro classes because ChatGPT can do all the homework in those classes. But for bigger classes where there might be humongous projects that are due, ChatGPT can't really do that all for you. It's going to require a special skill set.
I also just want to make the point, these are very serious points, but also the lighter point that you can have a lot of fun with some of these programs. And I know that people who are bored, you might read a book, but you might also have a conversation with ChatGPT about the subject you're interested in. And it is sometimes remarkable how well it comes back at you with things and points of view, or some of these artistic programs. So it's also something to just have fun with, right? If we're talking about the positive points.
Great. Did anyone have any other thoughts quickly on that? Awesome. So what's your prediction? Will the transition to AI-driven economies widen or narrow existing wealth, equity, and societal gaps? What do you think?
The science fiction author Ted Chiang a few years ago wrote very wisely about this, and he said a lot of the fears, or maybe, I think he said maybe all of the fears about AI are actually fears about capitalism. And I think part of what we're talking about here is how will these tools be used? Will they be used for good or will they be used for ill? And I think that the one really important point that I've learned over my whole career about technology is that a lot of times the technologists want you to feel that it's inevitable, that these things will happen and they will come to us, they will work in a certain way, and yet there are many human choices in terms of how they're designed and how they're regulated, and that we need to be thinking about that. Maybe we'll get into that a little more.
And going back to that point, I feel like there's a lot of hype around AI, and while not all of it's fake, obviously, a lot of the big companies that are investing in AI, I feel like there's a lot of this idea that AI is going to take over pretty much every job at some point, and it's not very clear if that's going to happen yet. The only reason this message is being spread is because a lot of the big companies, or a lot of the sources of this information are the big companies that are saying, you know, like for example, Elon Musk, who's saying that, I think he said that general intelligence will be reached in like a year or two. And obviously it makes sense that he'd say that because he's the one who's making it, he wants you to invest in the company. And so I feel like there's like a lot of fear mongering around this topic, but it's not really the case that AI is going to boom that fast. And even if it does, probably not as fast as a lot of the tech giants want you to believe.
Yeah, I think most realistically we'll see both gaps broaden and shrink, so in different ways. So when we think about language generation technology, for instance, I think there's a real benefit to people who are second language speakers in terms of machine learning really bridging some of those gaps. So better machine translation models and even things like Grammarly that can help people who don't feel confident in writing in the language that they need to use for business. I really do think that that's beneficial to groups of people who may have had a disadvantage before. But at the same time, there's definitely the potential to widen gaps as well. Something that I see in my research and my studies of how non-experts use code generation models is that experts, like professional software engineers, like both of you were saying, are able to leverage this technology really effectively because they're already experts in the domain. But when we look at non-experts, they really struggle to get the same benefits from these tools because they don't have that same foundation of knowledge to build on. And so there's a real possibility that some of this technology might help the people sort of at the top who are already experts do their job even better, while leaving behind some of the people who don't have the skills to leverage the technology effectively. But I think that really depends, like you were saying, on the choices we make as we deploy this technology, the choices we make in education, the choices we make in access. So I think, as always, the future is kind of wide open and it's up to us.
So maybe I'm going to pause here a little bit because we've been talking about AI, and I think this is a good point to really think back about what we mean by AI, because the question is, where do we see AI affecting for good or bad? But AI has been around for a long time, right? So if you think 4 years back, ChatGPT did not exist, we would not have had this conversation at Wellesley. Even though AI had been there for a long time. I mean, you were doing natural language processing. I was doing what I was doing. Dr. Joy was doing image recognition. Things were not progressing that much. And it is my true belief, and might be proven wrong, that LLMs, generative AIs, we are at kind of a inflection point in terms of productivity, in terms of society impact. And the problem is we're going to probably have companies making much more money for everybody else. Production is going to be going up, just like production was going up. GDP went up with industrial revolution. It was about a 20 times gain in GDP. And then you have world economies, you have even more the internet, that was even a higher production throughput. Now the problem with Gen AI, we're going to be able to do things much faster, much easier. I would like to push back about Python. If you ever tried to debug a Python code, I'm glad that we have LLMs, because the output of Python are horrible to even try to figure out what's going on. Now the problem obviously is who is going to be getting the return of not AI but LLMs, generative AI. And one would argue that those who are in the know will get the return, and those who are not using LLMs, who are not directly affected by that, are going to be not getting that. So there's definitely going to be a very interesting overall increase in productivity and wealth, but definitely moving away from equity even more. And this is where I think we need to think about what we want to do about that as a society and AI experts in the field.
To just add one thing on that, I think a clear winner is going to be the technologists building the technology. And I think if you look at this panel, there's a bit of a problem, right? Which is that has implications for who in society as a whole benefits. The technology community is far from diverse. And when we talk about those gains being concentrated in the people who are using LLMs, that has implications for, who, when we look at class and race in society, who benefits from those developments as well. So representation, I think, matters, and increasing the diversity of the tech workforce and field is really important.
I guess responding to kind of both of those things, I think one of the things that's really special about this moment is just how actually low barrier it is to get into these tools and to start using these tools compared to what it would be to do machine learning, to train models for a long time in the past. And in a lot of ways, I think that's actually an important part of this, because it really limits the extent to which there's the haves and the have-nots. It makes it less about needing to make sure that we're actively making sure that we're pushing this on everyone, because there's just an overall pretty substantial opportunity to take these things and do really amazing things at a whim, almost, maybe even too easy in some ways. But as one kind of example, an anecdote that we see in open evidence, for example, these tools are amazing, as you mentioned, at speaking in many different languages. Maybe not perfect, because there's an overweighting on English, but that multilingual capacity is something that is truly new. And even that alone, we see at open evidence, traditionally there's a way overweighting in terms of medical information in the English language. Overall, globally, medicine is largely practiced in English, and research is published in English. And what we see actually is that for as much excitement as there is in the United States, there's actually as much or more, especially in Latin America, and so we've seen in Brazil and Mexico, just a huge amount of excitement and support and use, because for the first time there are tools that speak in Spanish and in Portuguese and in all these things. And even that almost triviality alone, compared to the actual knowledge itself, makes a really big difference. And it's a really cool part of this whole thing.
Oh, thank you. Any other thoughts on that? Perfect. So Dr. Bolonwini's work has been very influential in pushing large tech companies to conduct data audits and obtain consent. And her testimony at congressional hearings has helped shape policy, including President Biden's executive order on AI development. So who controls AI development and now and into the future is a question for all of us. And are we moving towards a world where a handful of tech companies and militaries, for example, control the future? Dr. Bolonwini's story and her work encourages us to believe that citizens and scientists and businesses working together can influence the direction that AI is going towards social justice. So my question to all of you today is, what steps do you think citizens and businesses and governments should take to ensure AI advancements are accessible and equitable for all?
So I think one really important thing is to have conversations that involve different kinds of stakeholders, people in communities who are going to be impacted by the deployment of technology, people in government who are making the decisions about how to regulate technology, and companies that are developing technology. And one of the models for how these conversations can be structured that I teach in my classes is the idea of a community jury, where technologists would actually come to a community and propose some new technology that they would like to develop or deploy, and a kind of representative jury of different stakeholders would be assembled to kind of give their opinions about how that would impact their lives. And this idea is something that is very hypothetical, right? Like, this doesn't actually happen when technology is being developed. But I think as community members, as citizens, we can work to educate ourselves, educate other people, and be a little bit more active in participating in these decision-making processes. So push for regulation if you think the technology should be regulated. Push for representation in government of people who are knowledgeable about technology. Push for, education in the community at different levels around these issues and discussions. And in particular, something I would like to emphasize is I think there are certain classes of activities that really should be regulated and scrutinized heavily. So when we're talking about access to essential services, which in the book, for instance, there's the case study of the tenants who their building was going to install facial recognition as access to where they live. That's a critical service. I mean, the place, your home, what could be more essential to access? When we talk about essential services, I also include education, and also embodied agents that might interact with us in the real world, like self-driving vehicles or autonomous robots, things like that. Those impact all of us very directly, and I think the bar for releasing those kinds of products out into the world should be really high, because the stakes are very high. And I think it's sort of up to us as citizens to push to make sure that those products are regulated and scrutinized before they're deployed in the world.
I'd just like to add on to that point. I was recently speaking with Daniela Roos, who is the director of MIT's Computer Science and AI Lab, and she has the concept of the Food and Drug Administration for AI, in the sense that put the burden on industry to demonstrate that a particular use and product are safe. I'm sure that will be quite controversial among people who are working on AI. In California, we just saw the governor veto the AI regulation there because of pressure from tech companies. But Daniela Roos was saying that maybe the burden should be on the developer to prove that something is safe, as opposed to just letting it out there and seeing later what happened.
It's an interesting example, the FDA thing, because actually, there are many things. So much depends on the downstream application, maybe even more so than kind of like AI is this big thing in terms of what you're talking about. Like, what is AI, right? We're talking about it, but it's many different things, and it applies in many different ways to different things. If we're talking about a fun, chatbot that you can enjoy, right? Maybe some of these things are important. I can imagine aspects that are, but maybe less so than, for example, things that interact with self-driving cars or health and some of these things. So I guess it seems to me like the FDA in some ways is a good example of an industry regulating itself, and maybe the answer is more of that. For specific industries, the FDA should be responsible for regulating how it gets used in medical applications, and then it's then we don't have to talk about it like it's this baby monolith.
I'm actually going to jump a little bit here on regulation. I used to work in banking, and I was involved in banking in 2008 when the world crashed, and regulators came back and they said, "Banks, you guys messed up. We're going to be the grown-ups and teaching you how to do things, how to run your portfolios." I think that we are maybe pre-2008 when it comes to AI, because the current landscape of regulation within AI is very patchy and frankly hands-off. In the US, for example, the federal government doesn't really know what's going on. It's my view and others, I think, where they're waiting on Amazon and OpenAI of the world to teach them how AI, again, AI here, LLM, not more classical AI, how LLM and the current state of the research works. Then you have Europe, just like GDPR, which is the regulation on privacy. Much more stringent. Europe actually came up with an AI regulation. So kind of not necessarily very big teeth, but some guidance and something for companies to rely on. And then you have China. China is being China and being very authoritative. Now, granted, they do give guidance. Something is better than nothing, but within their guidance, any AI model has to, again, LLM models, has to be within party lines. So, for example, if you say, where is Hong Kong? Well, Hong Kong is part of China. And you cannot, it has to be within the socialist doctrine. So I think that this is where, right now as a world, we're trying to figure out how to regulate these things. And going back to, whoever was saying it, forget, but we are going to have to come up with our own push to our legislature as well as governing bodies to tell them what we want to do as citizens. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a 2008 type of financial crisis, but an AI crisis where we're going to say, holy crap, it's too late and something happened we didn't necessarily want it to happen.
I'm also curious, we all have our particular experiences with regulation in different ways, but what about our youngest member of the panel, like government or industry regulating itself? How does it appear to you?
I think it really depends on where AI is used, and I do think that the government should very much regulate it. For example, in the police force, typically AI is used in cameras that are on streets to help find suspects, but this can obviously faulty. And for example, in Dr. Joy's work, I believe she had a foundation where she talked with a victim of this like a fault in the AI, where he was wrongfully arrested for 30 hours. And I think what it comes down to is either making the AI better in like higher situations where wrongfully imprisoning someone is pretty we can all agree that's a pretty bad thing. And so in situations like that, we either need to make the AI better through better sets of data or through government regulation. Maybe we don't use AI to try and track down suspects. And same in the healthcare area. Maybe we improve the AI, maybe we don't use it, but there does need to be government regulation around these high-risk areas.
Anybody else want to weigh in quickly on that? Okay, so this next step, we really would love each of your expertise and specific answers or weigh-ins on these. So based on your background and experience, what is your prediction for where AI will be going in your field in the next 5 to 10 years? So let's do 3 scenarios. What we think will happen, what we fear might happen, and what we hope will happen. Mike, I'm going to start with you again.
Oh boy, how much time do we have on that? All right, so I start with so in scenario analysis, you do the expected scenario, what you think is going to happen. So at least in my world, in say Wolters Kluwer, where we are really trying to put generative AI within our products, so that if you are using something to do your taxes, or a doctor is looking at his or her notes, they can figure out what's going on. I think it's going to be much more common sense and maybe hidden to the user that actually AI in LLM is under the hood. Ultimately, it's going to make everybody's life easier, and as long as we don't mess up the regulations, as long as we have a fair and unbiased training set, and we watch all these things, it's going to make again society better. I truly believe that. Again, just like after the Industrial Revolution, women were empowered to work. I mean, in a bad way, they were still empowered to work, and that laid the foundation for today. And we might have, it's going to be bumpy for sure. We're not going to get it right the first time, but ultimately, I believe that the most likely scenario is that we'll be fine. Just like an evolutionary process, life has been fine, we will do that. In the optimist way, everything will be awesome. We will not have to work anymore, and machines will be talking to machines, and we'll get everything for free, and that will be awesome. Unlikely to happen. Now, on the extreme, on the negative side, I think that I was worried actually when I was starting to think about it. I'm like, what could be the worst thing that can happen? And I think that, and going back also to the lack of regulation, we have branches of the military that are spending lots of money on AI. Apparently, the Pentagon tripled the budget on AI in 2023. Why do they do that? Well, it's obviously to make their soldiers' life easier, safer, whatever. But what about going back to biases, right? If you have a drone fully controlled by AI, it has the opportunity to kill 2 people. Is it going to make a decision based on just factual, or maybe there is some bias in the training data set? It's going to be, killing the person that looks different from everybody else. So I think that we could get towards a Terminator type of future if we're not careful enough. And I'm going to finish by I was trying to think about how we could avoid that, right? And it occurred to me that, again, we have branches of the military, and we had the latest and greatest, which was Space Force. I don't even know why this thing existed. But this was, I think, 3 or 4 years too early. Because right now, we make the argument that we should have an AI branch of the military to not necessarily be, a fighting force, but a regulation and defense specifically on AI. That is independent from the DoD and NSA, because we know what happened there when we let these people with a lot of information. So that's my 3 scenarios.
Sorry, I think that was a farther view, like a very broad future view, but I thought about like very near short-term future. So my answer will be a little bit maybe less exciting. But I think in the short term, what I expect we'll see is more in the workplace, more effects in terms of productivity gains in particular jobs and less full-scale automation. And I don't think that that's that likely, even though there's a lot of hype around AI agents. I think we'll find that actually the people doing those jobs do a lot of other things too, and they'll instead use the agents to do their jobs more efficiently. My 2 fears, and again, speaking very practically about kind of short-term, close-to-home fears. The first is that there will be reckless deployment of these systems before we know that they work well. And this is something that I'm worried about because it's happened in the past. In particular, in education, there is a pattern in pretty recent history of what I would say premature and pretty reckless deployment of technological fixes, particularly in low-income and minority-serving schools. So these communities are often, I think, vulnerable to tech companies who promise gains that they can't really deliver. And I'm particularly concerned, given the debate about, how do we responsibly integrate large language models into education, that these less privileged communities, public schools, will see a lot of kind of rapid deployment, cost-effective, right? It's cheaper to deploy an LLM-based agent than hire another teacher, while the well-off communities say, oh, our schools are pretty good. We can just wait it out, and we can see what really works, and we can do this later. And so I'm worried in education, particularly about a growing equity gap between schools that can continue to do a kind of high-contact, individualized education with human teachers, and less well-funded schools that might be tempted to pursue, technology solutions that don't end up really serving their students well. And I think this is a really serious possibility because education is really, your start in life, and it can have these really serious long-term consequences for the students who are the guinea pigs in these experiments. Then my other main fear is how the kind of current trend of tech development interacts with the epidemic of loneliness that we've been hearing about in the US. I think, as a technologist, I've seen this sort of shift in attitudes about what's exciting in technology from the idea, maybe 15 or 20 years ago that technology was going to bring us together and facilitate community and facilitate relationship building. And like if you look at the early web or early social media, there was a lot more emphasis on one-to-one connections, connecting with people maybe that you also know in real life, or building these like communities. And in the last few years, even with social media, we've seen a shift more towards like one-to-many content creator to content consumer relationships that I think don't really contribute to a sense of community in the same way that maybe we'd hoped social media would. And also, when we talk about people chatting with large language models, and there's a question of like what kinds of relationships that might be replacing. And so I'm a little bit worried that a lot of energy in tech right now is going into technology that might make us lonelier. It encourages us to spend more time alone with our technology and less time like out in the world with other people. So that's something that I've been reflecting on in my own tech use, and when I talk to students about their tech use. And I know my colleagues at Wellesley have also been thinking about the implications of that. And then in terms of hopes, it's like end on the more cheerful note. I think that goes back to what we were talking about in sort of assistive technology versus automating things fully. I think the kind of bummer about AI recently has been it turned out to be much easier to automate forms of intellectual and artistic expression than maybe we thought it would be 10 years ago. And it feels like, man, everything we figured out how to automate well is like stuff we actually enjoy doing, And so I guess my hope for the future is maybe we can figure out how to actually automate some of those things that we don't enjoy doing and free up more of our time for the things that we do enjoy doing. And I think, that's another way of saying let's make AI that assists us rather than replaces us.
Well, I, for one, am looking forward to Skynet when that's our next branch of the military. That seems good. Yeah. No, I think what I see kind of very on the ground in thinking about building and how we use these tools to make new things, what I see is that this recent excitement and development in AI, and especially with large language models, is a really, truly, like, actual, meaningful step up in capability that we have for making things. It's real despite the hype in a way that, for example, crypto is not. I think it's probably fair to say that it's the single biggest kind of advancement that we've seen since the age of, since the development of the internet. And I think what I see kind of in this space right now is that it's leading to kind of probably the biggest commercial shakeup since the development of the internet. What I see is that it's this completely wide open field where very small groups of people can make very big impact and can develop new things. And specifically, it's like we've seen this enormous step up in capability, but we've only so far, I think, really seen maybe even 1% of what the application of that looks like. I think we're still just at the very early stages of where that leads, where that goes, how we combine these things in interesting ways, and put all of these kind of tools that do kind of small, specific things relatively well, but are not AGI, are not generally intelligent and smart. And it's actually an enormous opportunity, I think, to figure out how to put those things together to impact everything across the world. And so I think the next 5 to 10 years really looks like figuring out all of those applications and being really clever and thoughtful about making that impact the real world, and then also doing that in a way that where we're thinking about all the things that Joy is talking about in terms of who that impacts and what that looks like. I think my fear is a fear of I have a fear of fear. One of the things that stood out to me that Joy talked about in her book is that there's a kind of a general AI safety movement, which is very head in the clouds and very focused on hypotheticals and very focused on AGI and a very different future from what we have. And Joy's kind of here very focused on what are the problems we have today? When I'm sitting down and training a facial recognition model, what does that mean for the people who are going to use this specific model that I'm training? And what I see a little bit, especially you're talking about federal regulation, the government has no idea about any of this, right? And I'm not sure anybody really has a great answer. And I think partially that's because there's an abstractness to this. And so I guess my fear, more specifically, is that we lean too far into the kind of abstract concerns and ignore the desire and resources put into, let's do these things that we're doing, these applications, let's do those as well as we can do those, and let's make those really high quality, and let's make sure that we're being thoughtful to all the different people that it's going to impact. And so I guess my corollary hope for the future is that we're open-minded as a society, and we don't see this moment of change and kind of scariness and shy away from it, but embrace everything that it can do, because we can serve medical information better, we can make physicians more efficient. You know, this is the world I know. But there's like 20 more of these things, and I think we should do all of them, and that's where I hope the world goes.
So to start off with where I think AI is going to go in the next 5 to 10 years, in the short term at least, I think that AI will grow too far out of hand. A lot of, especially with, it's easy to think how in 4 years or so, or maybe 2 or 3, that ChatGPT came out and now it's already writing essays that can pass as, high school essays. And also with how I don't know if you guys know, but computer chips, they typically double in power every 2 years. So in tech, people typically think it's going to be exponential like this. I personally think it won't be that drastic of a change that fast. And so I believe AI is being used right now to simplify some of the more tedious tasks. I think it will continue to be used like that in the next 5 to 10 years. It will improve, but I don't think it will be replacing anyone. Of course, that is still my fear, though, that I'm not omniscient, I don't know everything. So maybe it is the case that people start getting replaced by AI. But I personally don't think that will happen. And my hope for AI is that, as it is happening now, it continues to be a tool that is fun for people and also helps people do the things that they don't want to do, and so people have more time to do what they do want to do.
In the media business, in all the time I've been in media, there's been so much stress and disruption from technology, and I think AI is probably just the next chapter of that. So I think, unfortunately, my prediction is a little on the negative side for the media, that you're going to see a lot of people experimenting with things and trying to gin up AI as a way to enhance news delivery and enhance writing and maybe bring it to you at a lower cost. But I guess my fear is that I'm not sure how well that will work out. And we're already seeing, if you do Google searches now, where an AI summary replaces the links to actual news sources. And so I'm not sure if that maybe is harmful to the economic model of newspapers and other media outlets. And we also have started to see just a vast sea of garbage information put on the internet that's written by generative AI, and it's just there to attract your click and collect some advertising revenue. Again, coming away from real media and real people writing things. So that's my fear. My hope would be actually that there is something more individualistic about AI that allows you to find more niche information, and those kind of writers and creators and video makers out there who are struggling to reach you but are doing something interesting that you would be interested in. So my hope for AI in the media space would be that it allows everyday people to find more interesting things for themselves. So I'll end on a hopeful note.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. So I'd like to invite our attendees to think of some questions for our awesome panelists. And while you're doing that, now that our panelists are sufficiently warmed up, I would invite you to ask each other questions of things that were said during this discussion, just for a few minutes while our audience is getting their thoughts together. Please, jump right in.
I'm a little curious what, we don't have to get into too much detail, but what's a really interesting AI application that you're using today?
So I'm not going to answer that because I don't think this is contractually what I can do. But I was listening to NPR a year ago, and it really dawned on me on the health side, right? You have AI models that have been trained to find diseases, so kind of not necessarily replacing pathologists, But looking at pictures and being much better than pathologists at finding there was cancer, there was some CT scan, there was some things. So to me, that was very interesting, right? So on the bright side of AI, really figuring out how we can best use computers to augment humans. I don't think that we will ever necessarily replace humans because we do need this knowledge, this research. Like actually doing research, I don't think a computer can do research. That's truly a human, thing to do. But we can definitely have this machine do the repetitive, tagging images. I was in cancer research for 4 years, and people would be tagging and measuring images. If only 25 years ago, we had this technology, PhD students would have a much easier job to do things. So that to me was kind of an interesting, immediate, use of AI for sure.
I can talk about my maybe weirdest AI research project right now, which is that I'm working with some art historians at Wellesley who are specialists in marginalia in medieval manuscripts. So these are like doodles kind of on the edges of paper pages. Think about you've probably seen the fancy illuminated letters. Those actually, surprisingly I learned, are not marginalia, but marginalia are other things that kind of look like that. But we're very interested in multimodal models like ChatGPT that can take images, because it's really challenging if you care about really fine-grained artistic classification of what's happening in these very weird doodles. My art historians have 100 different categories of things involving apes that show up. That's the most common kind of marginal doodling that you find in these medieval manuscripts, which was very surprising to me. Now, if you have a really fine-grained classification system like that, traditional machine learning, kind of the computer vision classification models that are talked about in this book, they don't work so well because you need a lot of examples of each kind of category or tag that you want to train your model on. But a multimodal model can take your whole picture, including the context of the text around the marginal image, and it can describe that to you in text, and we can potentially augment our classification models with some of that textual description, which can help us get past things like the different photographic conditions that those pictures are taken under, or the different styles that the artist drew them in. So I'm really excited for some of these really niche applications of multimodal models in the humanities. I think it'll open up a lot of interesting research.
Anyone else?
And actually, to just finish that, so this is actually a really good example of the democratization of AI, where a niche application like that would have never had the funding to have 100 PhDs in data science to develop whatever model. But generative AI is there for the taking, and this is one of the better uses that we can see for sure.
Anyone else?
So we'd still like some funding for this. If anyone works at the National Endowment for the Humanities, please accept our grant this year.
I'll just say, in the world of fun things, music generation has been really fun. We've started to see some viral TikToks with generated music with interesting lyrics from different sources, and it brings me a lot of joy.
Great. Awesome. We're going to turn it over now for some Q&A. I think there was a question over there. Do you have it ready for you?
I don't know how this exactly fits into a question, but the generators of this new realm of ours consist of academia, consist of responsible corporations, yes, but on the other hand, it can also consist of irresponsible corporations. I guess to some degree, irresponsible, educational circles, maybe. And then there's the freelance, which who knows where the freelancer is. So we're talking, I get the feeling that we've been talking, spending all this time talking about responsible AI, and within the confines of possibly, federal regulation, whatever. But where do we stand? How are we going to deal with those other realms that are out there for which we have no control? Is there anything we can do? That to me is, that's the person sitting on their couch, in their living room doing bad deeds. I don't know who said that. See if you can figure out a question there. What do we do about those other factions that are generating AI?
So we're going to have a go at it. So first you need to know that they exist. Right? And if they are really nefarious, they're going to make everything they can in their power to make sure that you don't know they exist. So I don't know how you're going to make sure, how you're going to find them. Maybe through some monitoring of outputs of the effect. Right? So you know that something's going on, but your job then is to find what's the source of the problem. Then there is frankly regulation, and I'm no fan of government, but at some point it is needed. Like it was needed in 2008. Banks had to really tighten up their models. We're going to have regulations around the use of AI, the development of AI. Now, I don't think that we should go toward the China model, where it has to be within the socialist doctrine. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Every model has to go through that, and China being an authoritative regime, they have to go through that, right? In the US, it's a bit, it's a free speech. So maybe I should actually turn it back on its head. Is it actually bad that people are going to have bad AI because it's free speech?
I think a lot of technological developments that have improved crime have proven very difficult to regulate. The Federal Communications Commission has been trying now for a decade to wipe out spam that comes in your text messages from fake phone numbers, very unsuccessfully if you look at your text messages. So I think it may be very difficult to find a technological or regulatory fix for the ways that AI is starting to already be used by criminals and nefarious people and nation states. So I think it's going to go back to the old human responsibility to educate people about how to best avoid these kind of things when they come up, and I don't think there's going to necessarily be a silver bullet.
I was really taken by Dr. Anderson's comments around education. This has been a general panel, but one of the things that strikes me is that a lot of what we talk about is what AI can do to help people do things. Most of modern human activity, at least in an economic sense, is about people doing things. But it seems like a huge place of promise is helping people think. And so I think, in the educational realm or in the medical realm or in other realms, what do people see out there as the early indications that these tools help people think better as opposed to do better? And how can we move the conversation in that direction?
I think the short answer is there's almost no evidence that tools help people think better. And I think we can talk about the reasons that is. Maybe the first is because the profit comes from helping people do things better, right? So there maybe is more financial incentive to make people better at doing things. No, I think there can be financial incentives to make your workers think better as well. I mean, that's another route to productivity. I think it's a hard question because I think we don't know very much about what it means to think well. And that is a harder thing to define and measure. But I do have some short-term concerns about the ways in which deploying this technology early might make us think worse. That is, I believe pretty strongly that using this sort of prematurely in the education sphere could weaken students' critical thinking skills by sort of having them rely on this as a crutch. No, I think this is very context dependent. There's certainly places in education where it's appropriate and useful to use these models. It just depends on like what your learning goals are for that activity or that exercise. But I think it's a really hard temptation for students to avoid, and that has made education just undeniably harder right now.
So, this is kind of interesting for us because we see doctors use open evidence in lots of different settings. And one thing that we see in particular is that there's kind of a specific form of use when you're at kind of the MGHs of the world, Boston Children's Hospitals, the places we're privileged to be near in Boston. And that's very different from, I think, a lot of the country and a lot of the world that doesn't have access to that information. And one thing that is very specific, I think, about this modern form of large language models is there's a very natural kind of fluency aspect and a very natural kind of conversational aspect. If you're at the MGH and you are seeing a patient that maybe has a rare disease or something like that, you're in a privileged position to be able to stick your head out the door, yell down the hall to the world's leading expert on that thing, and have a conversation about that. And that, as a result of that conversation, there's thought that comes out. There's new knowledge, or there's something meaningful, and you can treat that patient better. If you're an oncologist in, I don't know, rural Kentucky, you might be the only oncologist in a 200-mile radius. And what we see a little bit with open evidence and tools like that is that these tools provide the ability to kind of be, maybe not a perfect stand-in, but certainly better than nothing for sticking your head out the window and having that quick curbside consult. So I think, what we see a little bit in terms of that sort of kind of real actual use is, I think there is a little bit of meaningful kind of thinking and knowledge generation that happens as part of that conversation that wouldn't be able to happen otherwise.
I think in general, even though AI can do some of the thinking for people, being able to think on your own is still going to be very valuable. I think, for example, there's calculators, and so you might say, well, why learn math if a calculator can do it for you? And it's obviously because learning math, I find it interesting, but also in general, it teaches you how to think, and that is more valuable than just being able to press numbers into a calculator and getting a result. And so the same with AI, you could have AI do things for you, but at the end of the day, it'll be much better for you if you know how to think through things and basically use AI as a tool. So I think AI doesn't really help people think, but it helps people do things. Not really helps people think, but at the end of the day, I think it's still very important.
I do think for the writing process, actually, the tools do help me think sometimes, where I ask it to summarize a large number of documents that I've already read and see what it comes back with and how that compares to what I was thinking. Have I missed something? Am I overlooking something? And actually, with some of the writing tools, you can actually even say to them, this is my, I'm arguing this, and this is my evidence. Tell me how people could poke holes in this. And it will come back and offer counter arguments. So I do think, at least in my sort of in the knowledge worker context, it can be helpful in honing your thinking.
So I'm an adjunct at Merrimack College, and we are apparently being asked every month by different companies to include AI in our teaching as a TA. So, and I don't know, I would love to hear your view on that as a former professor, because the way these companies are saying is, hey, you can have an agent or an AI model doing the critical thinking, so arguing the contrary, right? So whether it's debating or saying, hey, we just went through, I don't know, whatever, the flowers in the Himalaya. Do you really understand it? And I'm gonna ask you questions just like you would pair students together. So that to me, and I love your idea of thinking versus doing, because right now there's a lot of doing, but I think that there is a world where models are smart enough, and frankly are getting there, or if not already, to actually enhance thinking as long as they're done right. Have you seen that?
So I review a lot of papers on these kinds of tutors, intelligent tutors and teaching assistants. I have yet to review a paper that I recommended to be accepted, frankly, to an academic conference because the evaluation was so terrible. I mean, I've probably reviewed like 24 of these papers in the last 6 months, and it's a very hard thing to evaluate well. So to bring it sort of back to the themes of the book, it's, one of Dr. Williams-Weeney's contributions is like rigorous evaluation of these models, and I think the education landscape is one where evaluation is really hard. And I also think with LLMs these days, I mean, everybody knows that there are huge challenges around factual inconsistencies and lack of knowledge, I would say. Like, what is a factual mistake but a lack of knowledge? And so I personally wouldn't want to deploy something in my classroom that could spread misinformation about what I'm teaching. That's like the opposite of helpful. But that is potentially an area where this technology could improve in the future. There are lots of people working on fixing problems with factuality in models.
So I just want to add one point. This gentleman asked regarding responsible AI. A couple of months ago, I was attending a conference at DC for federal government on generative AI. As you know, in today's world, with so many social networks, misinformation, disinformation, and all generative AI being so advanced today, definitely regulation is a dire need, and federal government has established a framework, and also they are working to kind of come up with a regulation framework. So every department in federal government, they have appointed an AI officers. I think down the line, in a few months or a year or so, I believe that something is going to come up. I have one question for the panel as well. As you know, we have been living in a rapidly progressive digital world. Since ChatGPT and large language model or OpenAI has come out in the market last 2 years or so, many schools across the US has banned using ChatGPT. And not only that, I think many countries also trying to kind of enforce regulations. Okay, we should not use this kind of technologies. It's going to replace all our jobs. But at the same time, it is rapidly being implemented across the corporate world. Now, my question is, what should we do in our schools so that we can rather banning these technologies, but rather upskill our teachers or reform our educations so that we can prepare our students for the next generation corporate world?
So I have sort of the devil's advocate answer to this, I think, which is that we know, tech companies who make this technology have told us that their workers benefit from it. And I believe that professional software engineers are more productive when they use these models. What I infer from that is education as it is now prepares people appropriately to use these tools because existing workers in these companies weren't educated in an era of ChatGPT in the classroom. So I guess my standard of evidence for this benefiting students, deploying LLMs in education benefiting from students is quite high because I see that, right now we're already sort of preparing people to use these tools well. Now it's possible that there's some sort of upper limit where people could use them even more effectively, but I'd like to see evidence that deploying these in the classrooms actually helps you reach a better level of mastery than traditional education and then, a short amount of training in the workforce does. Because I'm pretty worried about the ways in which deploying generative AI, particularly for students who struggle to regulate their own work habits, can have an effect. I think in particular, a lot of the people who are pushing to use this technology in school are the students in some cases who are doing great, right? It's the student who is an expert programmer and could benefit from building more sophisticated projects. But I'm worried about the student who is really struggling to learn the basics in their class and could very easily sort of use this technology as a crutch and sort of not actually learn those fundamentals. And so I think, it's important to hear from a really wide group, consider a really wide group of students and think about who would benefit and who might be left behind by introducing technology early. So that's part of the reason that I'm pretty cautious about saying we should deploy this technology quickly in schools before we sort of understand how to do it well. I also think it depends a lot on your learning goals for each activity. So, maybe there's a way of balancing activities where students don't use generative AI and learn those fundamentals with some activities where they can use generative AI to do something more exciting than they might have been able to do in the past. And I think, in my own electives at Wellesley, for instance, that's sort of how I think about things. In my intro programming class, we don't allow generative AI. But in my AI course, of course, students are, learning how to use these tools. And in general, in upper level classes, for something like a final project, I think it can really speed up what they're able to do in a semester. But, you have to balance that, the need to develop those fundamental skills with how this might change.
Actually, going to jump off on that. Years ago, when calculators were introduced, there was a fear that people would not be able to do linear algebra because if they cannot add two numbers, how can they do something more complex? Guess what? I've worked with a calculator, I could back in the day, do linear algebra. I think we're there also with ChatGPT and all that. They are there, they're not going to go anywhere. So I think that we need to learn, and to your point, we need to be cautious. I think this is your point, right? At some point, 20 years down the road, we're going to be using it, for sure. The question is, are we, don't go too fast, and let, students and young professionals get used to those tools. And frankly, I think academics are going to be catching up with students. We see that all the time, right? I live in England. There was a student who used GTP for his final project. This went in the news apparently, and he got a D because apparently the teacher didn't like it. Now, Hingham being Hingham, the parents sued the school district because there was nothing in the code of ethics that he could not use GTP. So those are very interesting cases.
I'm actually curious for you as an educator, how do you, is it effective to ban it? I think like the calculator example, right? Calculators existed and we all learned our timetables without calculators because, I don't know, it was quite easy, to be like, okay, I'm sitting here writing with a pencil, not using a calculator. For something like, introduction to programming, or is it effective to just be like, please don't do this? Or can you tell? How does that interact?
I mean, in some sense, I think from a kind of academic integrity point of view, it's not super different than just the internet. If you didn't want to write your CS1 homework by yourself, you could find solutions online in homework. So in some sense, I don't think generative AI is really that different from just Googling and getting somebody else's code, which students could do, students do. I think in the intro level, yeah, it's pretty easy to tell because we know exactly what we've taught students and then they turn in code that uses other things we haven't taught them. I mean, maybe you can't always prove it, but you usually have a bit of a spider sense. I think something that isn't obvious if you're not a programmer is that there's a pretty distinctive style in how people program, especially, I would say, non-experts as they're developing their skills. It's pretty idiosyncratic, the kind of code that they write. And so I always hide my students' names when I'm grading, but in a class of 24, I can often identify exactly who submitted which program because I know their personal style. And I think that's really not obvious to people who haven't programmed themselves. Is it effective to ban it? I mean, I don't know. Is it effective to ban Googling? I mean, is it effective to have standards for academic integrity? I mean, is it effective to have morals, I guess, is a broader question, right? If just because some people do a bad thing, does that mean, we shouldn't be sad about it? I mean, I think it's worth teaching people habits that serve them well. So the way that I try and teach this to my students is to say, and I use the same rule in my own use of generative AI, which is to ask for each thing, am I learning from this process? And if the answer is yes, then I want to do it on my own. If the answer is no, I've already mastered those skills, then I think that's a place where you use generative AI to speed up the process. And so, you know, in my own research, that's how I approach the use of generative AI. Am I learning something from this process that I wouldn't learn if I automated the process? And I think in a classroom setting, oftentimes the answer is, yeah, they're still learning something from that process. If they're not, then like, we probably shouldn't be having to do that activity in class because class is about learning. Yeah, so that's my take. But yeah, let's hear the student perspective.
Yeah, so I think what has been said about calculators so far, I completely agree with. I think in schools typically, like, you know, until 8th grade or 9th grade, you're not allowed to use a calculator, it's prohibited. And then, you know, now, you know, you're taking tests and the teacher's like, yeah, take out your calculators, you're gonna need it. And so I think the same thing should happen with ChatGPT eventually, maybe not right away, but I think teachers need to start allowing, because people are going to use it, people can use it, and it's a very useful tool to, I guess, get like a first draft done. But after that, you know, if you submit like a, you know, raw ChatGPT paper, you're probably not going to get a very good grade in an English class. And so I think it needs to be prohibited in the until maybe like 10th or 11th grade. And after that, you can use it basically to make a first draft if you want, and then you can edit the first draft. And I think, of course, I'm talking mainly about English and history class, so I think this is where ChatGPT has the biggest effect in, you know, writing students' papers. I think they should start doing more in-class essays, because at the end of the day, the whole point of these classes is to, I guess, learn about history, but also to learn about how to analyze text, and also how to make arguments given pieces of evidence, so analyzing evidence and making an argument. And this can all be tested through in-class essays, which also, you know, very hard to use ChatGPT if you're being monitored in an in-class essay. So I think the takeaway is this is a very useful technology for students because it can help with very tedious tasks. But teachers just need to change the way they, I guess, give out assignments to make sure that students are actually learning and, you know, not, I guess, using ChatGPT and not learning.
I have a concern about the role of experts in developing the things you're doing. Michael, you mentioned pathologists, helping pathologists, and Zach, you're developing things that are going to make help in making diagnostic decisions. And as people use these things more and more, are the kind of people that want to become real deep down experts on, say, pathology or certain diseases going to rely on them too much and no longer have the incentive to really become the world's expert on lung cancer or whatever, because they have the tools that's helping them make a diagnosis. And I know when you develop a diagnostic test, even if it's something as simple as a COVID test, an at-home COVID test, you, in the end, have to make a decision as to where my false alarms are going to occur, and you do that by reducing the sensitivity of your test so that you don't call too many negative people positive. And how do you do that? You assemble a panel of experts, and they really delve in on this problem, and finally you come to a decision. And I know they're just these wonderful people that just know the ins and outs of pathology and stuff like that. And are we going to lose those people because we have too much AI?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think definitely no. I'll say maybe two things. First is I really agree with what you've been saying and what we've been talking about in general in terms of there's all these little things that go beyond kind of the bird's eye view of, you know, what anything is, say pathology or whatever. What I know is computer science, very simple, and programming. There's all these additional tasks. There's nuances and discussions and all these other aspects. And even as we kind of get at some of hopefully the mundane aspects, or maybe aspects that can be augmented as like a co-pilot or something like that, you know, what I see is that we're nowhere even close really to really replacing humans, especially in mission critical areas. And I think the humans in those areas know that more than anybody else in terms of, you know, for my specific thing, the thing that I know so much about, like, often the reaction is like, this is super helpful, this helps me in time. For example, one of the earlier things we heard from, I don't remember exactly, but I think a neurologist, was like, I'm an expert in this space. I'm an expert on this exact type of neurology. Maybe it's brain cancer or something like that. But wow, like I just asked to put in a few queries, and I was able to find some references that were going to be helpful for my meta review that I had never heard of before. So I think even for experts, there's plenty of room to be a co-pilot, but it's definitely kind of not in a replacing sense. And I don't think that person, for example, was especially concerned that they were not going to be needed or whatever. And I guess what I would maybe encourage you and actually everybody is to poke around any of these tools, and ChatGPT especially, with stuff that you know a ton about, because I think you'll get a sense for what it looks like, in your exact expert of domain of expertise, and because everyone's an expert on something essentially, and that's what these tools I think will end up kind of doing.
I just want to add, I guess this is related to the point that I made earlier, that research is not going to be made by computers. By definition, even LLMs are back rear mirror viewing, in that they are trained on existing knowledge. Now, I'm no LLM expert, I work on that and I teach, but I don't think that they can come up with new information, net new knowledge. Because ultimately, especially LLMs, all they are is very good at repeating existing information. They're very good at connecting dots that already exist, but if you are talking about a breakthrough in science, like I was researching, I was an academic back then and researching in blood flow. I don't think a computer model will be able to do it just yet. Now, with the advent of general AI as well as quantum computing at some point, maybe, but not necessarily, hey, this is where we need to advance knowledge. So I think, if anything, taking the example of a professor in pathology, right, who is still in the hospital, I used to be part of MGH back then, who is part of, still looking at patients, looking at slides, maybe not wasting his or her time looking at mundane slides, but looking at, because that could be used by a computer. And if the computer, frankly, is right at 99.99%, that's much better than any human. So I would take the computer, frankly. But getting the expert and looking at really, things that are a bit nebulous, where the computer says, I don't know, what do you think? And then actually making time for more critical thinking. That is actually going to be a good thing.
So thank you, panelists. We are coming to an end, but we may have time for just one more question. We're trying to stop by 5 so that all of you get to meet our panelists and have a nice chat. So,
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Tanuj, I appreciate your remarks about having folks use AI when they're older in school. However, I sense that perhaps in the high school they'll have a class someday that says it's how to effectively use AI, but I think students would need to teach it, not the teachers, because the younger generation are the ones that are the experts. I do, and my background is in higher education, educator, and when I did my work in the 80s and 90s, a lot of our research was based on researchers that did all of their research on white guys, white college kids, and then so all the data, all the references that we had were based on a small population. And when you talk about, all the panelists talk about the integrity of the data, I see that that can be a concern as well. Because if we don't, we end up getting a very white population that we're drawing from, for example. And do you think, I know we talked about regulation, do you think that the folks who are using AI, I know of many of them, they're for-profit organizations, but could there be a sort of organization, professionalist organization that could shape the integrity of this that does not fall on government regulation?
This I think connects to one thing that I was thinking as I was reading for this book too, which is that there's often, my answer is kind of, in some ways, capitalism. For example, I think the clearest example of facial recognition is, in my opinion, iPhone opening when you look at it. And if that product only worked for white people, that would just be a bad product, right? It would be enormously embarrassing for Apple as a company, and it would also just be a bad product in terms of not serving its user base. And so I think that in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, as these things touch base with reality and are grounded in real applications, there's a sense in which things that are just better in the sense of they meet their users and with their users' real needs. There will at least be some tendency, I think, to meet that need and to meet all of the users. And if companies are not doing that well, there will be other companies that do that better. So that's at least one incident, and it's definitely not the full extent.
Robert, and we have a person who wants to ask one question. I know we're kind of out of time, but just to throw it out there.
Thank you. A lot of the environment community is saying the cost of using ChatGPT and all is so expensive, don't touch it.
I think the statistic is that 5 queries to ChatGPT is like using 1 plastic water bottle, right? That's some sort of, it's very hard to measure these things. OpenAI is not very open about its energy consumption, many other things. But there's certainly an environmental impact for all of this technology. There's an increased energy consumption fueling the AI revolution. And I do think it's good to think critically about your own usage. Where is this really benefiting you, and where, does existing technology already work pretty well? Maybe you don't need generative AI for, say, information retrieval. Maybe you can Google instead of asking ChatGPT. One of those is cheaper environmentally than the other. But there are other applications where there are, where generative AI is really doing something that you couldn't do with existing technology. But I definitely think it's a very important issue, and one that we hope that future technology will become more energy efficient, but still an open debate.
So on that, AWS, Google, Microsoft have all signed contracts to have dedicated power generation to their servers. We're talking nuclear power plants. And to your point, if you have a choice between Googling or using ChatGPT, if you want to be green, Google, because Google is going to be net zero emission in 10 years. They are basically on track to I think they are already 50% net zero emissions. And also, since we're talking about equity and impact on society, not just AI, it's important to realize that yes, everything, all your data lives on the cloud. All of the GPUs that you're using to come up with, but the GTP is coming up to come up with to generate something, lives somewhere, and there is a social justice also that has to happen. Right? Where is all this waste going? Are we going towards a model where we are shipping even more waste to African countries like we are? Our recycling, our used appliances end up in Africa because we don't want it, and they're taking it and polluting their countries. So that's a big concern for sure, and I don't necessarily think that we have cracked that yet. But what we know is it's going to be much more hungry from an energy point of view. All the information.
Fantastic, thank you, panelists. Can we have a round of applause for our awesome panelists? I'd also like to thank our World of Wellesley board members, Betsy Zanizer, Dee McCollum, and Sheikha Warnick for putting this lovely book discussion together. So thank you. Book copies for sale. Back there at the back tables, so please feel free to stop by. And we have Ziploc bags, so please take some food on your way. And panelists, you're off the hot seat, so please feel free to step up and come mingle. Thank you again.